This is The Camp with Zach Heilprin and the Athletics' Jesse Temple.
Yes, welcome in. We're another practice into spring ball. Badgers been on the field for 5 of them, so they're a third of the way through. Be back on the field Thursday morning. We're also getting an opportunity and we'll talk about what happened on practice or in practice on Tuesday coming up here in a little bit. But wanted to start with something a little different because we've got an opportunity to chat with the outside linebackers on Wednesday morning. And some of the names are obviously new guys. Some of them are older faces, and some of them are very old faces, but are also new. And that was kind of where I wanted to start, Jesse, because there's a guy that has been around for quite some time, but very few people have actually gotten to see him play a lot of football. There was a lot of excitement early in his career, but injuries have taken a toll. He was able to get on the field late last year, and this spring we've gotten to see him every single practice so far. It is Aaron Witt, the outside linebacker, the big guy. I can remember when he first came on campus, there was a lot of people that were very interested to see like what his career would end up being. I know that when we were talking about this, I think 2022, the spring of 2022, going into the 2022 season, that former outside linebackers coach, Bobby April, was really excited about his group, but really was excited to see Aaron Witt. And obviously he never got that chance before moving on to Stanford after the 2022 season. So it is Aaron Witt. He has been able to do some stuff with the first and second team defense. He's been getting a little bit of time with both, but I think more interesting is his journey to this point, because he came in 2020. He turned some heads in the bowl game that year, and he's essentially not been heard from since.
Yeah, I had a chance to talk to him about his journey and his path, and I think we all knew that it was one filled with injuries and a lot of setbacks, but no one really knew what it was. And what's crazy is this is the first opportunity that any of us who cover the team have had to talk to him as an actual member of Wisconsin's football team. I went back and found a story I wrote on him in May of 2020 when he was still a high school recruit. But we never talked to him because when he actually played in that bowl game, it was a COVID year and you only got people on Zoom, and he's been hurt ever since. He said that he went through 4 surgeries and 3 stress fractures, and it was a combination of injuries in his right foot and his right ankle. And what happened was it began in spring ball of 2021 when he broke his right foot in practice. And then he was getting ready to come back for preseason practices. He broke the foot again, and he also sustained damage in his ankle. And at that moment, he said rather than undergo another surgery, he chose to allow everything to heal on its own. And so he missed the 2021 season, but the ankle never fully recovered. So we had what he called a pretty big surgery in the spring of 2022. Somehow he was getting ready to return in the summer, and he broke the foot again. It's just wild. And so when he was trying to come back from that in 2022, he learned that the first surgery he had on the ankle part of it didn't heal the way that it was supposed to, or the surgery didn't go as planned. He just learned it later on. So that forced him to have yet another operation. And if you're losing track of everything that I'm saying, you are not alone. I was losing track as he was saying all of this. The point is, it was a 2.5-year grind. And he said that there was a good year and a half where he was struggling mentally, and that it impacted him physically, because you come here, and he said, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for football. Obviously, he earned a scholarship to Wisconsin as a football player. So he said, when football gets taken away, you start asking, what am I doing here? And you're not really a part of the team because you're not participating in practices. It's really, really hard, especially having to go through that as many times as he did. But then last summer, he was able to start jogging again. And then he finally had a realistic path toward playing and was able to stay healthy. We know he was finally medically cleared to play in that regular season finale against Minnesota. 1,061 days between appearing in the Duke's Mayo Bowl and that game against Minnesota. And Pro Football Focus listed him as playing 4 snaps on special teams. He obviously played a few more snaps in the bowl game. And he's from Winona, Minnesota. And this is another element to this story. So his family was able to be there, but he also said his mom was diagnosed with cancer about 2 years ago.
Jesus.
And so that it was even more special because he went through all this, but she was able to see him play. And that battle sounds like it's still ongoing. But so Aaron Witt and his family have obviously been through a ton, and that is kind of the backstory. And now he's putting himself in position to have a legitimate chance to get reps and be a key contributor this season as a fifth-year senior.
Did he ever say, was there any point where he's like, screw this, I'm done?
No,
Did that ever enter into his mind? Because I think most normal people would be like, after that third or fourth time where things aren't going right, maybe even after the first or second time it's not going right, maybe the average person is, but just shutting it down, being like, this just isn't meant to be.
he was asked about that, and he said, "We talk about our why a lot." I remember that was something that Paul Christ would ask players a lot, and so I assume that's something that players still talk about. And he said, "I think for me, a lot of who I am is rooted in football, and I come from a family where you just show up to work every day, do what you can." And he said, "I didn't think anything real special about it." So for him, it was never a thought about I'm going to walk away. It was as long as I've got an opportunity to keep at this, I'm just going to continue to work. He said, you show up to work every day. And he expressed a lot of, first of all, when you go through all this, you have a ton of perspective about what it means to actually be out there. And so when he's asked about next season, it'd be very easy as a player to think about, oh, what's my role going to be? He said, whatever September holds, it holds, but I want to be here today, playing today. So he's got that measure of perspective, but he also has the perspective of how many people it took to help him get back to this point, because the saying goes in a lot of different scenarios, it takes a village, and it really did for him to lean on his family, but also athletic trainers, people in the weight room who helped him, and also Matt Mitchell too, who is now his position coach. Mitchell was hired in January of 2023, and at that time, it had been more than 2 years since Aaron had even played a down of football. And Witt talked about how he was one of the people who believed him, even at a time when Aaron didn't necessarily believe in himself. And so now he's got an opportunity to kind of back up what Mitchell maybe saw in him. And there's another thing, just having a guy like that in the locker room, man, what talk about a level of respect that you command. I mean, Daryl Peterson called him, he's a true warrior. I mean, that's the best way to put it, that you see what a guy like that goes through. And Daryl's been here for like 4 seasons and yet has never played with him. So this is a pretty special opportunity for everyone who's been witness to his journey.
So the journey is what it is, and everything that he went through leading him to this point. Now the actual on field aspect of this comes into play.
Yep.
Do we think he is a player? Because based on some of the stuff that I've seen in spring, and I think I asked Luke Fickell about him last week, or someone asked him about Luke Fickell last week. Excuse me, asked Luke Fickell about him last week, and said that he just kind of just brings a little different energy. You can feel a little different energy was on the field, and I think you could definitely see that. I mean, when he's coming off the edge and he makes a play, everybody knows about it, and everybody hears about it. And I think he just has that little extra spark. And I know there was a lot of hope for him earlier in his career. What do we think he can bring to the field after going through what he's gone through?
Yeah, I don't think this is lip service when you hear everybody echo something similar. And Mike Tressel talked about it too. He said that Aaron plays with such passion, intensity, and physicality that all of his teammates can feel it on the field. I really do think that matters. Matt Mitchell was asked how many outside linebackers you could potentially play, and you get asked that a lot of times at every position, and it doesn't sound realistic. Oh, we're going to play 6 wide receivers. Okay, well, I'll buy that when I see it. But it doesn't sound unrealistic for him to play 4 outside linebackers. In his perfect type of scenario, he called it, he doesn't want ones and twos. He wants what the staff has called 1As and 1Bs. But what he means by that is, can you get a 50-50 split of guys or a 60-40 split? And we know that he talked last season about how CJ Getz basically had to play, it seemed like, every snap. And that wasn't good for the team, and it wasn't necessarily good for Getz, especially with the number of snaps that these guys have to play in college. So I certainly think there's an opening. You just look at the distribution in terms of who's playing at that position. you have two early enrollees that are true freshmen, Anelu Lefele and Thomas Heiberger. And while Heiberger has flashed, you've still got these four veteran guys, and I can see all four of them playing. In terms of what Aaron Witt's role could be, it's very clear that his strong suit is in the run game. And Matt Mitchell called him extremely violent at the point of attack in the run game. And that is his best skill set. Now, where he's got to get better is as a pass rusher. But Mitchell said, I mean, some of this is you have to have a feel for the game. You can't really get a feel for the game when you're on a scooter for the better part of 3 years. So I think that will take a little bit of knocking some of the rust off. But I do think that he can have a role, and I think his role is a little bit different from the other guys. Obviously, we've heard and talked about Lowry and Pius, Leon Lowry and John Pius, the two transfers coming in, and how they can give this length and athleticism and be disruptive off the edge. And Daryl Peterson, Mitchell said Peterson's the only one of those four guys who he is currently cross training now at what they call the will and the jack linebacker positions. He wants to keep each transfer at one spot so they can just grasp it, and he wants to keep Witt at just one spot because he's finally coming back. So I think they can all have a different role, and that is a long way of saying I do think Aaron will have a role in some capacity. It's just hard to say at this point how many snaps a game that will be.
It's funny you talk about that just because talk about him as a run guy, because what do we know him and what do we talk about when we think about Aaron Witt and what he did early in his career? It was what, 1.5 sacks and the forced fumble that he had in the bowl game. Is like they need that pass rusher, and
Yeah.
It sounds like obviously he's got some room to grow there, but he is a different kind of body than they've had there too, right? I mean, he is legitimately 6'5", 6'6", and like long arms, and a guy that they haven't really had at that position. I don't think. I mean, I guess you kind of had it in Isaiah Green May, but he was really just tall and long arms. He didn't necessarily ever have the weight to go along with it. Speaking of Isaiah Green May, he's back with the program in a recruiting role, but they've never really had that guy as an outside linebacker. So I mean, I'm anxious to see what it looks like with Aaron Witt, and obviously, knock on wood, he's able to stay healthy and give them something this year. Is there anything? I know you're going to be writing about him, or you already, by the time this comes out, it'll already be up on the Athletic. So go and check it out. And certainly many more details that maybe we aren't getting to here. But the other outside linebackers that spoke today are guys that I think a lot of people are interested in, specifically Leon Lowry and John Pius, two guys that have really, we haven't seen a ton of pads work, but in the stuff that we've seen, both the one-on-one drills with the offensive linemen and some of the 11-on-11 work, it feels like they have a chance to be bigger disruptors than what was in that room last year.
Yeah, I could tell that Mitchell is pretty excited about what Lowry has done so far. And we talked about it on the last show, especially a practice that he had last week where it just seemed like every time he looked up, he was in the backfield. It was a couple sacks. It was stopping Will Pauling at the line of scrimmage. It was jawing with guys on offense. This is exactly what they needed at this position. They needed impact playmakers. They needed guys with size. And you talk about how Witt is 6'6", 248 pounds. It's an interesting juxtaposition with Peterson, who's only 6'1", but yet is 247 pounds. And you've got guys who are in between that, obviously, with Pius and Lowry. I think they're very clearly excited about both those guys. They're both going to have really big roles, and they've come in early and shown why they are capable of that. I think it's interesting that those were two of the guys who were practicing with the team at the bowl game. I imagine we'll see that more and more in this transfer portal era, but they got as much of a head start as they could, and it's showing early in spring ball.
We have talked a lot this offseason already of trying to limit expectations and prove, and show us. And when you talk about the things that they do well, then it's always like, all right, well then what does that mean for the left tackle, or what does that mean for the right tackle? What does that mean for the offensive line? So we all have to at least temper the expectations. But when you look at the athletic attributes of those guys, it is different. It is like CJ Getz, for everything that he did and all the snaps he had to play, he was not necessarily a guy that was going to jump off the page athletically at you. He was one of their best run stoppers. Bobby April always talked about that. And it was kind of why he was one of those guys that had his hand on the ground when they went to their dollar package. But athletically, this feels like as athletic a group as they've had these last few years. Like Nick Herbig, athletic, don't get me wrong, but like as a group, when you add in Thomas Heiberger behind them and some of the other bodies, younger bodies behind them, it feels more athletic as a group. Now, what does that mean on Saturdays in the fall? Not much, but I'm just saying when you look at it, when you look at those guys and the way that they're playing, it feels different.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And you never know how that's going to materialize on the field. You still need a defensive line to be somewhat effective. And I think there's probably questions about just how good that group can be. And
Who's going to be involved in that group?
yes, um, and just because these guys are doing it in practice doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate as consistently in the games. But I think this staff knew it needed to make some changes at key positions to put them in a better position to succeed. And at the very least, and I know it is the very least, considering they're coming off a 7-6 season, it seems that they have made those changes. So I think they certainly feel good about what they have, but we've got a long way to go between April and when they're lining up against Alabama at Camp Randall Stadium.
In talking to Matt Mitchell, did you get a feel whether any of those young guys might be able to help them this year?
Thomas Heiberger is certainly the one. And it's still remains to be seen whether that means he's going to get snaps at outside linebacker, but it sounded like it could be a real possibility as one of those young guys who gets snaps on special teams. And that is so important, as we've seen over the years. Sometimes you have freshmen who don't take the redshirt year, but they're getting all their snaps on special teams. Um, that's still really important experience. So I think he can certainly have a role. I don't know what that looks like as an outside linebacker, largely because of the four veterans that we're talking about, but he has certainly flashed in the opportunities that he's gotten with the speed that he has and the ability to close off angles. So he's one to watch, I think, from the group.
You could hear that, huh? All right. Well, that's good. People, look, doing this not in the office today, sitting at home doing this, you're going to run into issues with dogs. And this what was doing an episode of Kenny and Halpern like this last year when we got our second dog, and he just walked right in front of me and just peed all over the floor as I was doing the episode, and I had to be like, "Well, the dog just peed." So
I was
yes,
going to let you edit that out. So
no, it's fine. I don't care. You're when you have to go take a cat out of the room, it is what it is. We all have things that are going on. I just have a dog that won't stop barking and stop being that guy. So it is what it is. But moving forward, Wisconsin obviously was on the field on Tuesday. They'll be on the field coming up tomorrow morning as well. On Tuesday, it felt like that there were some more explosive plays in the passing game than maybe we had seen earlier. Did you get a feel for that? Did you see the same thing as me?
I did. I mean, we didn't have much to go on in the first few practices, so anything would have been a step up in terms of seeing more downfield shots. But yeah, and I think that's an encouraging sign. And this is what you want to see because Luke Fickell talked about it after practice. Practices 5 through 9 are really kind of when you start to turn up the heat a little bit and you get into more of those competitive situations and you want to see progress, especially from your top two quarterbacks, to show that they can push the ball down the field. And we did see that from both those players. And that also means that you're seeing good plays from some of these wide receivers. Mentioned Quincy Burrows in the last show. He had a diving touchdown catch in the end zone. Yes, against a reserve defensive back. Kyan Barry Johnson, the reserve slot receiver, early enrollee freshman, had a really nice catch down the field from maybe retire. So I know when something good like that happens, it means the defense might be making a mistake. But at this time, I think it's really important for the offense to start showing it can push the ball a little bit more down the field.
Yeah, and I think the Quincy Burrows thing, even though it was not necessarily against, I mean, who was that? That wasn't Jace Arnold?
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like this isn't last year, Jace Arnold. This is year into the program, Jace Arnold, that guy that was fresh out of high school that should have still been in high school at the time. He had perfect coverage. Like the coverage was perfect. It was right there, and it was just a great throw and an even better catch. I think Quincy Burrows is the guy that when you look at this offense, you really do like what they have in possession type players in a Bryson Green, who can also make some plays down the field. He's just not a burner. And then you have CJ Williams, who maybe isn't necessarily a burner, but can make plays. And your slot receivers and Will Pauling and Tretch Kahuna, both guys I think are able to play down the field, but aren't necessarily the big bodies Quincy Burrows is a big body that can run. And if he's able to give them something on that side, that's the dynamic speed receiver, big speed receiver, explosive receiver that Phil Longo mentioned last year when he was talking about when the offense can really start humming. And it was kind of what we saw in the bowl game a little bit, but obviously that wasn't Quincy, but having Vinny Anthony on the outside too. They were trying to add a little explosiveness to the outside, and that's still where Vinny Anthony is going to be. But can Quincy Burrows be that guy, you think?
Well, I think he's going to be a factor at wide receiver this season. And I don't necessarily know that it's if it even if it's not the big play guy. I think we talked about this on the last show where I'd mentioned Burrows and you were wondering maybe what I saw. And I said it wasn't a single wow moment, but it was like even as a possession receiver, go get a first down. I had in my notes, okay, he's on a drive with Van Dyke and he catches a pass for a first down, and like 2 or 3 plays later, there he is catching another pass. That stuff's so important too. I do think it's if you were evaluating this wide receiver group, you say, okay, Bryson Green probably filling one of those starting spots on the outside, right?
Yep,
Would we agree on that at this point?
we do.
Um, Will Pauling in the slot, and who's that other guy? And Burrows has just as good a shot as anyone else, whether it's CJ Williams or Vinny Anthony. And between those three, to my eye, Burrows has clearly made the most plays among those three. Now, again, that's not going to guarantee you anything in September, but for a guy who only caught 4 passes last season and was kind of in the shadows of all the other transfers, especially with Will Pauling emerging, I think it's been a really important stretch early in spring for Quincy Burrows.
I would agree. I want to flip over to the other side of the ball because we've talked about Aaron Witt, and it reminds me of another guy who's had a little bit of a battle, and we won't get to talk to him until later in spring here. But it was a guy that was asked about, and Luke Fickell talked about on Tuesday, and that's Max Lofi, a
Yeah.
guy who wasn't like heavily recruited, but was a guy that people thought was going to have a shot, especially as a slot guy. And I know that Jim Leonard liked, and then he missed all of last year. And Luke Fickell even admitted that he kind of like forgot about him because I think he maybe practiced once in the spring, maybe did not practice at all in the fall, or was the other way around. Either way, he was just not there. And Luke Fickell kind of like admitted like he kind of like wrote him off, as
Yeah.
in, he's not going to help us. And this spring, and I know, it's a developmental period, so who's lining up where it is kind of is what it is. They're just trying to give guys opportunities. But Fickell said, as you saw on Tuesday, he was getting some run with the starters. And that to me is intriguing, especially right now, because obviously Kamoi Latu is not going to take part maybe too much more in spring. He suffered a shoulder injury that on Saturday that Fickell said is probably going to keep him out, or at least if it does keep him out, it's not going to allow him, if he's able to come back, it's not going to allow him to maybe hit anybody, which is probably a good thing for some guys on the offensive side of the ball. But he's not there. Austin Brown's a guy who, can play in the slot, has been with the starting group as a slot, but can also obviously play safety. So he moves back, it opens up that spot. And Max Lofi might be a guy that could jump in there and take that.
During the time you were talking, I was able to pull up the Pro Football Focus numbers on Lofi because I think it's easy to forget. 2 years ago, when he was healthy, he was a key contributor in the slot, and he played 126 snaps as a slot corner in 2022. Obviously, before he got hurt, a couple of those games played a bunch of snaps there. And so he gives them more versatility. And obviously, the number one option, based on what we've seen, would presumably be Austin Brown. That is when you've got a healthy Kamoi Latu and Hunter Wohler, because they like a bigger body, and they certainly like what Brown was able to do in really his first reps at the position in the bowl game against some very talented players. But if you do get into a situation where someone gets hurt or you need to move somebody around, I think Lofi is a pretty solid option, and it helps that he has experience playing that position.
And he's not a small body either, right? I mean, he's not tall by any stretch, but he's built. And
Yeah.
I don't think it like this isn't like throwing like 175, 80-pound guy in there that won't be able to hold up. I think he would be able to hold up and will have an opportunity to compete for that job if he's healthy. Like we also just assume that RJ Delancey's going to get thrown in there at some point, right? Like when Ricardo Hallman comes back, you just feel like they're going to throw RJ Delancey in there and let him compete. Did you think that is going to end up being the case? I don't know. I think that's just the assumption by everybody that when Ricardo Hallman is healthy and he's going to be a starter, and you have Nazir Forkerine and Jonas Klona, that you're just going to move RJ Delancey inside.
I'm mostly surprised that we haven't seen Delancey take reps in the slot. It's been, if I'm not mistaken, exclusively on the outside.
Yeah.
And I think we've addressed this, but my assumption when they brought him here was, oh, he's played in the slot at Toledo. He's coming here to be in the slot because Jason Maitre was a 1 year guy who's gone, and they need someone to play that position. And that hasn't been the case. But that doesn't mean that it won't be the case moving forward. I don't know whether it's uh they just want to get reps in the slot for other guys, or they think they might need Delancey more on the outside, but he's shown he can do both. We just haven't had a chance to see him do both so far in this spring.
Yeah, I think it's going to be intriguing when Ricardo does come back. He's still rehabbing from off-season shoulder surgery. I know when the coaches were there on Saturday, a lot of them then went and tweeted, we're saying some things like, oh, he wasn't really running well. I mean, he didn't have surgery on his legs or anything lower body. It was upper body. So we'll see how he rehabs, and he'll be ready to go once fall camp comes around. And then I'm sure things will get adjusted. It is a period right now where they're just trying to get a number of guys get a number of different looks. And we actually kind of saw that on the offensive line too, right?
Yes.
On Tuesday, when all of a sudden, like I did like a double take. I'm like, what? Joe Huber? He's at right tackle because Benshall's at right guard. So is Riley Mallman hurt? And then you look behind him and Riley Mallman's just fine. And so they wanted to get him some work at right tackle. They also did the same thing on the other side. They moved Joe Brunner out to left tackle, gave to in place of Jack Nelson, and had Benshall in at left guard. What did Fickle say about that?
Well,
if I recall, I mean,
yeah. So go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, he wanted to give some guys because last year they had no injuries. They didn't have to really move guys around. That's probably not something that's realistic all the time in every single season. And a guy like Joe Hubert can play almost every position. Joe Brunner's a little bit a bigger surprise. Now he played, I assume, just based on him being the best player on the field, was the left tackle in high school, but he's been mostly left guard in college. But I think they're just trying to give guys some more reps because they really don't have a ton of depth behind them.
Right. Of all the position groups, the one that is to me among the most fascinating is this offensive line, in part because this is Wisconsin we're talking about. But I did a mailbag this week, and it was questions based strictly about what I'd seen from spring practice so far. And the first question that I answered was how big of a concern the O-line depth is, and it was a how did we get here type of question. Like, for so long, it seemed like there just weren't enough reps to go around, and there was a backlog of 4 and 5 star guys on the second and even third teams, and it was like, well, what the hell happened here? And I think it's obvious that the Michael Furtney, who was a starter, used up his eligibility. Tanner Bortolini left for the NFL, but you had 2 guys that you were presumably banking on for the future, or guys who were going to be veterans that could, at worst, fill out your 2 deep into the transfer portal, Nolan Rucci and Trey Wettig. And you didn't add any transfers, and you've got 5 freshmen coming in, but only 2 of them are here. So what they've ended up with, at least at this point, is you got your top 5 guys who have largely been in the top group. And then after that, every other offensive lineman on the roster has played a combined total of 33 snaps in their career. JP Benchwell has played 27, and Barrett Nelson has played 6. And Barrett Nelson, by the way, is coming back from an injury, so he hasn't been a part of this. And that's why you got a situation where there are 6 walk-ons in the 2 second and third team getting a lot of time. And I think right now they're in a spot where the reason they're doing this cross-training is, to my mind, what happens if the stuff hits the fan and you need backups? I think you're going to take your starters and make them the backups, which is why Joe Huber's getting reps at center and why Brunner's getting reps at tackle. And then you just move JP Benchwell up to play one of the guard spots. And that's kind of what it feels like right now, which is why they need to develop these guys as much as they can. And boy, that 2 line and that 3 line are very interesting this spring.
They are. And that actually brings me to my to my next point here, and that is the transfer portal. Because you you can tell me what the question was, but you tried asking Luke Fickle about this on Tuesday because the transfer portal opens up here in the middle of spring ball.
Yep.
It'll be closed by the time spring ball is over, correct?
Yeah. Did the
Yeah.
window
But,
closes, the window to enter at least closes
yeah.
April 30th, and the last spring practice is May 2nd.
So you tried to ask Luke Fickle about it. Can you tell me what the question was going to be?
Yeah. So sometimes I start my question with like a preface of like, hey, the transfer portal is opening in a week. And what I wanted to ask was not whether he thought anybody on his team was going to leave, because that isn't a fair question. And I would not ask him that question. I was going to ask, first of all, I mean, what do you think about that? That it's in the middle of spring. And secondarily, what I had hoped to ask was, based on what you've seen, do you feel like there are any positions you think need addressing? And I wish I would have been able to ask that. I may not have gotten an answer. I know I wouldn't have gotten an answer because when I brought it up, he just kind of said, I'm not talking about that. And he said, I think what I gathered was part of why they structured practice the way that they did was so that maybe they could have a chance to look guys in the eye. And maybe it was why their spring practices go through that portal window. I'm not really fully clear, but I just know he was not interested in discussing any aspect of the transfer portal. My assumption is that maybe he thought I was going to ask him about losing guys,
Yeah.
which was not what I had intended to do, but he clearly didn't have much of a desire to be talking about the portal. But this is the nature of the game, and this is obviously everyone behind the scenes in the program is evaluating who's going into the portal, what position groups of need will there be, and frankly, there are going to be guys who are going to leave. I'll be shocked if everyone who's on the roster right now is still there April 30th, because that's what college football is now.
Yeah, I mean, I can promise you that it won't be, right? Like that's just not going to happen. There are guys that are competing for time right now, and if it doesn't work out, they may hit the portal. I'm talking about like way down the depth chart, right? Like scholarship guys that are finding it difficult to think of a way to get on the field are going to they're going to move on, and that is the nature of what it is. But I will say, it was interesting when he was talking about the lack of offensive line depth. He mentioned the guys that transferred out. He didn't say names, but he said guys that transferred out, that guys that were going to compete for time, compete for starting jobs are no longer here. And he's obviously talking, you would think, about it like a guy like Nolan Rucci and a guy like Trey Wettig.
Yeah.
And probably not Dylan Barrett, but Dylan Barrett in terms of depth. Those are three huge depth pieces that you probably were counting on that are now roles being filled by guys further down the depth chart, including guys that, are either walk-ons or true freshmen. And that's asking a lot at this point. And so I feel like that they may try and add via the portal, but as we said in the last show, doing that at an offensive line position where you don't necessarily think that there's starting jobs available, at least this year, there's not starting jobs available. That's going to be difficult to get somebody, a veteran that's coming in that has experience, that's willing to sit or be the sixth guy, right?
Right.
Like Trey Wettig was a perfect sixth guy, a guy that could play multiple spots and was willing to do it last year and even the year before. And this group was not willing to do that. And Nolan Rucci is a little bit a different case. I don't think he ever ends up at Wisconsin without his brother being here. So as soon as he wasn't here and as soon as Jack Nelson was coming back, it was like those two things made too much sense. And I think he probably leaves even if Jack Nelson is gone. Like it never felt like that was even the greatest marriage. But those guys move on, and you're filling it with a bunch of inexperienced depth at this point, and that has to be a huge concern. And I think they could look at the transfer portal here in the spring, and also why they're doing the cross training, as you said.
Right. And the quote that Luke talked about with the offensive line, I put this in the mailbag, is we're just trying to make sure we build the depth there. Why he was talking about they were moving some of those top group guys around, because we lost quite a bit with some of those guys that left and transferred that were really guys that were going to compete to play and to start. And so I think it's very clear who those guys were, but at the same time, neither of those guys in my mind were locks to start. I mean, we know Nolan Rucci was the left tackle. He was the backup to Jack Nelson. Well, Nelson came back. So unless they were thinking he was going to vie for Riley Mahlman's spot at right tackle, he was going to be behind somebody. And Trey Wettig, we saw what happened last year. He wasn't even a factor halfway through the season. So they're in that spot. And as far as the transfer portal, I don't know even how much the scholarship numbers matter anymore, whether you just move a guy off and if he was a walk-on at some point and do NIL stuff. I mean, I know they have to have 85 at some point, but they've got, as it stands now, I believe they're set to have 13 scholarship offensive linemen. So there would seem to be wiggle room, hypothetically, but I think what you would need is the perfect situation is somebody with multiple years of eligibility who was willing to come here in this first year and not demand a starting job, but potentially be a contributor and then become a starter next year. I mean, there's a lot
of guys like that in the portal, huh?
I think there are some people like that out there who would like to be at a place like Wisconsin who can contribute and then be a starter next year, but it takes a special kind of guy. And so that's always the challenge. It's the challenge in football and the challenge in basketball when we talk about this as it relates to the Badgers and any other team. Why are you leaving your school? Probably because you're not happy and you didn't play. So would you want to go somewhere else and then not play as much? Well, it takes a special kind of guy.
Yeah, no, it does. It takes a Stephen Vogt type guy to be willing to come off the bench and be that backup big that every team in the country would be happy to have. And it's not like he was great by any stretch, but he gave them the exact thing that they needed. And the exact thing that they need along the offensive line is a veteran that could fill in at spots for a certain amount of time and potentially compete down the line. But right now they have true freshmen who I think, were highly recruited kids. You just never know. And playing true freshmen early on the offensive line, while it's become more of a thing, it hasn't always been a thing at Wisconsin. And, assuming they get the way that they want this to work out, it won't be the case this year either. But based on history, outside of last year, you're going to need depth at the offensive line. And right now, it's a little uncertain. It's not bad. It's not bad depth. It's just uncertain depth. Uncertain depth behind what they have in that starting five. So, again, a lot of interesting things happening at spring ball. They've got 10 more practices to go, starting with Thursday morning. We will talk about that one coming up tomorrow night. We're going to be at Monks and Sun Prairie for Temple and Heilprin. If you want to hear about that practice, you can either listen live from 6 to 7 on the Zone in Madison, or you can find the podcast, Temple and Heilprin. Find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll break that down and look ahead, and we'll talk some basketball as well tomorrow night, as the transfer portal there is also very noteworthy as things get tighter and whether they're going to be able to find some guys here in the portal. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Camp.